kind of odd, but I guess it's the way it is, the way it's supposed to be. But I'm glad this is, you all, I don't have to review too much because we've done the Matthew, Mark, and today is Luke. It was an interesting thing to me that Matthew and John were disciples. They were eyewitnesses to Jesus. Right? Mark and Luke were not. They came to the faith, the Christian faith. And Mark, because also known as John Mark, because his mother, Mary, had a house church. It was one of the largest house churches in the town, and Paul, Peter, all of them came to that house, to the church, and he was a young teenager who caught fire about Jesus, and got to travel with Paul, and got to travel with Peter. In fact, Mark was Peter's interpreter, because Peter didn't speak Greek, and Mark was a little more educated, so he interpreted for him and stayed with him all of his life, through his jail experiences and things like that. Well, Luke, on the other hand, is credited, and by historians, and his style, is the same, did the book of Luke and Acts. And if you check out the chapters and all, Luke did 1/3 of the New Testament. Paul did 1/3 of the New Testament. So between those two people, that's 2/3 of the New Testament. The other thing about Luke was that Luke, and what I'm getting at about Mark and Luke is that their history was kind of sketchy as far as who they were and what they were doing. Most of the information about them comes from the stories that are in there, or the books of the Bible, where we can draw stuff from it, such as the fact that Luke knew Matthew and Mark because of the connection with Paul and Peter, and so we know that Luke drew from what Matthew and Mark had done before. So he had their information. And the thing about him, it says he was possibly a slave. He started off as a slave. And that what families did at that time was they would have their slaves trained to be doctors, so that when someone in the family was sick, they didn't have to go out and get a doctor. The slave was the doctor, and that's how Luke became a doctor. Yeah. And so, and then, in following the history of Luke with Paul, because when he started traveling with Paul, many of those instances where Paul was stoned and he was thrown out of town and beaten up and persecuted, it was Luke who doctored on him, who was his physician. So then he traveled with Paul through all of, not all, but the majority of Paul's missionary trips and journeys. In fact, it says at the end, when Paul was, when everybody was deserting Paul and leaving, Nero was the emperor of Rome at the time, and he was persecuting the Christians. I think I mentioned in one of the others about how he actually started a fire in Rome because he wanted this land for his monuments and things he wanted to do, and he blamed it on the Christians, and so that's where a lot of that heavy persecution came from. Anyway, Nero Paul was under Nero's sentencing, and everybody started disappearing and leaving because it was just the persecution was that great. But it says that Luke stayed with him. He never faltered or went away.
Can you imagine? I'm stuck on the slaves being taught to be physicians, and today
Well, and here's one of the things too, is that was the thing about Greek and Roman philosophy, that they were advanced for their times.
Yeah.
The Greeks and the Romans were their knowledge, their information, and all that stuff. It was real. I don't know how to say it or describe it, but they were way ahead of their time, and that's why we still have records of their of history and architect and all that.
All the Roman people, you talk about slaves becoming physicians and all this kind of stuff. Rome was a country that sought out the best of each country they conquered.
Absolutely.
They took the best slaves, the best women, the best horses, the best whatever, and they kept it for themselves. So when they found an intelligent slave per se, that particular slave didn't go to the slave market for gladiators and all that kind of stuff. They made use out of that individual, and that's where the doctorship came in, because they found out somebody that was smart enough to learn, and everybody in Rome wasn't mean and evil. They had some kind people that showed, kindness and wisdom to even some of the slaves. They were slaves, but they were household slaves. They stayed in the house, they honored the house, and they were free to roam around the house, but they knew not to, leave or whatever. And that's how a lot of them got their, earned their freedom later on, through the kindness of the masters. So if they were kind enough to let the slave do that, then a lot of them were kind enough to teach them, like you said, about being a doctor or whatever, and allow them to be, to learn. So that's kind of what, that was about. And I see that in Luke's case.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. The other thing too that was real neat was that Luke is the only Gentile to write a book in the Bible. There's no other Gentiles. Luke's the only one. And he went about it researching. And imagine, now this is the thing that I thought a lot about. Imagine he was living at the time when the disciples were there.
Right.
So he was able to interview Mary, Jesus' mother. And he was able to interview all the disciples.
Well, during that time of Nero, all the disciples, except for the ones that had been, crucified or whatever, they all got together at certain points.
Right.
Paul met Peter where they met up. He met with different ones, especially on his missionary trip, because he had Silas with him one time, he had somebody else with him one time. They waited on, this one to show up, they met, Peter here and there. So they were able to contact and meet up with one another for different times,
Yep.
And so yeah.
Yeah, and I always kind of thought to myself, wow, what kind of questions would I ask Mary, or would I ask Peter, But he was able to do that, and he wrote a narrative, and the narrative is kind of, he never, the name Luke is only mentioned 3 times in the Gospels. Because he was humble. He didn't want it to be about him. He wanted people to see Jesus as the means of salvation, and what a great healer and miracle worker he was. And that's what he portrayed in his book, the Book of Luke. And you'll notice the stories. They start off with the birth of John the Baptist. That's what Peter that's what Luke starts off with, and it's written like in third person. In other words, it's not I was there or I did or it's he did or he went or we went, and it's written to Theophilus. And you'll notice also that Acts is also written to Theophilus. Most people only recognize that Theophilus must have been a new Christian, so he was new to the Christian faith, and that's true. So we get a lot of our information about growing the church, growth of the church, history of the church, and growing in Christianity from the Book of Luke and from Acts. And as Dr. Maddie in our Life Christian University class, we recognize that Acts is ongoing.
Yeah.
We're going through, we're part of Acts now as our church moves
Yeah,
on.
that's strange, because I was thinking about that the other day, Acts of the Apostles. And if you listen to that, it's actually telling you what the apostles did then, and like you said, it's ongoing, because it never stopped. It never stopped.
That's right. So as an introduction, why do we want to read the book of Luke? Well, does this book offer anything that can't be found in the other Gospels? Yes, it offers plenty. Just as a witness at a trial does more than confirm the story of another witness, Luke enlarges the story of Jesus. You'll gain new information from Luke and see Jesus from a new angle. Of all the gospel writers, Luke gives us the greatest variety of teaching, parables, and events from the life of Jesus. Luke, who was a companion of Paul the Apostle, Luke, who also wrote Acts, was probably a Gentile and also a medical doctor. Luke wrote to Theophilus, who was probably a Gentile and who was likely either a new believer or someone seeking to learn about Christ. Theophilus means lover of God, leading some to think the book was written in general to people who love God. Luke hoped Theophilus and other readers would learn that God's love reaches beyond the Jews to the entire world. And further on through my research, I found out that Theophilus was a highly placed Roman, he was in government. He was a highly placed Roman government official who was converted. So he was new Christian. The book was probably written around 59 AD. What do we look for in the book of Luke? Well, we watch for ways that Luke elaborates on the accounts of Matthew and Mark. You'll find new information here, more stories about Jesus' birth, for example, and the parable of the Good Samaritan. You'll also see Luke's personal perspective in the incidents he included. Stories, for instance, that demonstrate Jesus' interest in the non-Jewish world and the poor. And then, as I said, it goes right off the bat, it starts talking about John the Baptist, which adds to what we already had from Matthew about John the Baptist, and it enhances and increases the story. I like the way he goes into a little more in-depth, and which adds to our information about not only Jesus, but about the story of the Magi and Herod, and right on to the taking of the census, where they had to get out of Eden, they had to leave. Also, when he talks about the crucifixion and the resurrection and all, that's where the story gets a little more enhanced. And it's also, I guess that's where a lot of people tend to say that the Gospels, because in several instances, let's see, let me give you some examples. In several instances, Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the same stories, or the same thing. And in some instances, all four of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. For instance, the Jesus being baptized, that is in all four of the Gospels. Jesus being tempted by Satan, it's only in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus calls the four fishermen, that's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He begins preaching in Galilee, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus tells about kingdom parables. He quiets the storm. Jairus' daughter raised to life. Oh, that's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So those three books tell the same stories, but they tell them from a different perspective. And if you'll recall, Matthew was a Hellenistic Jew, which means that he was a Greek Jew. So, and as the story is told, you know, remember when, it was Moses. Moses he had so many responsibilities with all the people. And the Hellenistic Jews didn't feel that they were being treated as the other Jews. And that's when Moses' father-in-law said, give some authority to some other people. And he picked 70 people, and so that kind of quelled that. But those were that was the Hellenistic Jews who felt that they were being treated differently. Mark was he was a Jewish person, so he wrote from a Jewish perspective. Well, Luke writes from a Greek perspective, the Greek people, Greek customs, which were different than the Jewish customs, and so a lot of what he wrote appealed to the Greeks, and they could understand a lot easier and better. But the point I was making about naming where the majority of them are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Several of them are all four Gospels, but the stories are told from those different perspectives. So that's why sometimes people will say, well, that sounds different, or it's, but it's the same story, and it's appealing to the same people. The thing that Jimmy and I, I guess we got to the bottom of it, I don't know, was...
about Antioch.
Yeah. Everybody's heard Antioch. Antioch was one of the big churches. It was a big city in the Roman Empire. But my research said Antioch, Turkey being the country, and Antioch, Syria being the country. But Antioch itself, the town, what the best I can figure out from looking on Syria was that in the ancient days, Antioch was in Syria, but in the modern times, Antioch is Turkey now. So what used to be Syria, the country of Syria, is the land used to be the country of Syria, is now the land that belongs to Turkey. So I guess they got it right. But they had both.
It's a little confusing when you read it.
Yeah, very confusing. Very confusing. Let's see. To explain a little further, and I guess you can't talk about one without talking about the other, and that's Luke and Acts, because originally I guess they were a two-part writing. And they're only divided by, I think, John, as far as the order in the Bible. But Acts tells of the beginning of the expansion of the Christian church. Acts justifies the mission to the Gentiles as the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. Acts also defends the church against charges that it was a threat to the Roman Empire. Paul joining the church and his 3 missionary trips in what is now today Turkey and Greece. Another interesting point here is that when Luke is talking about the birth of Christ, he talks about it from Mary's point of view, and so which further